Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined by Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Absolutely. I was going to think, we can't this weather last forever. Then I realised, oh yeah, global warming.
That might be, although global warming is supposed to make it wetter, which I suppose many people in Europe are realising this week. Not here, thankfully. Coming up tonight, the government have announced when buffer zones around abortion clinics will come into effect. Tory leadership hopeful Kemi Badenoch has said some more bizarre things. And Starmer's chief of staff, Sue Gray, is back in the headlines. Stay tuned for all of that. Of course, though, the big story today, the second day of Israeli attacks and explosions across Lebanon. Hundreds of people have been injured and 9 people killed in further explosions across Lebanon as Israel has expanded its attacks on Hezbollah. And while the attacks appear to be similar to yesterday's involving exploding pagers, this afternoon has also seen radios and radio receivers involved, lots of walkie-talkies. One of the explosions took place at the funeral of 4 of the victims of yesterday's attacks. Among the victims being buried at that funeral were a young boy and the son of a Lebanese MP. That funeral was held in southern Beirut, a Hezbollah stronghold, and attended by many members of the group. And the attacks today and yesterday are thought to have been carried out by Israel's spy agency, Mossad, with Hezbollah fighters their target. Now, Sky's Alex Crawford reported from that funeral this afternoon.
There are hundreds and hundreds of people here, including many women. You can probably see them behind me on the steps, and children. People have come with their children and families. We heard a small, I wouldn't even describe it as an explosion, a sound of something popping, like a firework going off. We had died. There were a number of MPs who were there, Lebanese MPs there as well. We came out to try and find out what the sound was, and people were running, some of them covered in blood. There was fragments on the floor. There was blood on a car, splatters of blood on a car, and inside a car. One young man was running, and he was very, very stressed. We asked him what had happened. He said a walkie-talkie, one of the two-way radios that many of the Hezbollah security people around here are using for this afternoon's funerals, had exploded. We then saw a number of people, the Hezbollah security, gathering up all the walkie-talkies and taking the batteries out of them.
So you can see how far and wide this is impacting people. So she's talking there about Hezbollah security, people who are providing security for a funeral, right? These aren't people who are in the process of some attack on Israel, and these are people whose walkie-talkies are exploding. Also at that funeral, you've got lots of women, you've got lots of children, you've got lots of MPs, right? So this is not, every now and again on Twitter, I say this is a very targeted attack by Israel. This is not a targeted attack. From that description, from that 1 minute description from a Sky reporter, you can see how widely these attacks are being felt. And the explosions, of course, haven't been limited to Beirut. In Sidon, southern Lebanon, a mobile phone shop appears to have been affected by the latest wave of explosions. Smoke was seen rising from the building with the emergency services in attendance. There are also multiple reports of solar energy systems exploding in several areas. Today's attack follows a wave of pager detonations yesterday, which injured around 2,800 people. So far, 12 people have died as a result of those attacks yesterday. So that's, of course, on top of the 9 who have so far been killed today. Now, amongst those killed yesterday were 2 children and an unspecified number of health workers. According to the country's health ministry, 300 people were also left in a critical condition. One of those severely injured by yesterday's blast was the Iranian ambassador to Lebanon, who was escorted to hospital immediately after his pager exploded. According to Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, Mujtaba Amini lost one eye in the attack, with the other severely injured. Now, eye damage was amongst the most widespread of injuries inflicted by yesterday's wave of explosions. Now, that's thought to be because the pagers released a notification sound moments before exploding, so users were looking at them as they detonated. Gaping groin and abdominal wounds were also common, and for those who had the pagers in their pockets. And many of the pagers went off in public. This CCTV footage of a pager exploding in a supermarket shows the power of the blast, as well as the threat the explosions presented to those nearby. So the blast, you can see, froze the owner of the pager backwards by several feet, doubling him over with such force that his head smashes into the counter. Meanwhile, the woman serving him is protected from serious injury only by the shop counter. The assessment by munitions experts is that the pagers were packed with explosives. That has also been confirmed by a Hezbollah source speaking on condition of anonymity. The source told AFP that all the exploding pagers belonged to a single shipment of around 1,000 devices recently purchased by Hezbollah. And according to AP, inspections of pagers of the same kind that didn't explode led Hezbollah to conclude that 3 to 5 grams of a highly explosive material were embedded in their circuitry. Now, as to why Israel struck yesterday and today, this is from Axios, who report this. A former Israeli official with knowledge of the operation said Israeli intelligence services planned to use the booby-trap pages it managed to plant in Hezbollah's ranks as a surprise opening blow in an all-out war to try to cripple Hezbollah. But in recent days, Israeli leaders became concerned that Hezbollah might discover the pages. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, his top ministers, and the heads of Israel Defense Forces and the intelligence agencies decided to use the system now rather than take the risk of it being detected by Hezbollah. That's from a US official. So the idea here being that the Israelis had managed to plant these explosive devices in this equipment that was being held by various members of Hezbollah. You often hear them sort of described as militants. There's also a political wing, lots of people who work in local administration, essentially. So a wide variety of people. These had these sort of explosive devices on their person. According to this theory, Israel were planning to let them off just before some kind of invasion, but they had to let them off a little bit earlier because Hezbollah were about to realize what was going on. Now, this afternoon, Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, gave a speech at an airbase. Now, in it, he explicitly complimented Mossad and the entire defense establishment for their great achievements. Now, as is often the case with Israel, there wasn't a direct mention of the attacks in Lebanon, but the implication is very, very clear. So they like to say, we're not admitting to this, but we're happy to imply it was us. Yoav Gallant went on to say this: the center of gravity is moving north. We are diverting forces, resources, and energy toward the north. I believe that we are at the onset of a new phase in this war, and we need to adapt. We will need consistency over time. This war requires great courage, determination, and perseverance. So I suppose linking back to that briefing to Axios, if the idea was that these were going to explode just before an Israeli invasion to the north, I mean, Yoav Gallant makes it seem as if that invasion could be on the way. Obviously, getting all these devices to explode is itself an act of war or terrorism, depending on how you define it. I'm joined by Hannah McCarthy, a foreign correspondent based in Beirut. To begin with, I assume people were only just making sense of yesterday's attacks when today's round hit. What do we know about what has happened this afternoon?
Sure. So there have been attacks across Lebanon, in Beirut, in Saida, and in Nabatea. So I guess the most kind of dramatic one happened at the funeral, as you said. It was the funeral of 4 victims of yesterday's attack. I spoke to some people actually just, while they were finishing up at the funeral, and they said that, there was a few explosions, a few people panicked and left the funeral, but actually the funeral went ahead. They said it was kind of remarkable to see people just going on with it. Either some people hadn't gotten news that the funeral had been attacked yet, or people were just stoically continuing on. It's not clear yet. There was an office that was damaged in an explosion in Nabatea, an office of an Amal parliamentarian. They're kind of allied with Hezbollah. They're kind of would do more of the political work and the business work. And again, we saw other attacks in Becca. So as you said, it wasn't the same type of device that was exploding. It was a walkie-talkie device. So there's questions over, again, Hezbollah's approach after Tuesday to reviewing their equipment. and the fact that they had not already checked these devices to see whether they had the same type of explosive device as the pagers. So I think there'll be questions internally within Hezbollah about how that was allowed to happen. People said they saw people at the funeral simply throwing away their walkie-talkies just for fear that they would explode.
Is this fear now also leaking out to sort of the wider public? Because, I mean, yesterday you had these pages, now you've got these walkie-talkies. I mean, I've seen reports of solar panels exploding. Is there a lot of confusion among the public at large, or a lot of fear, I suppose?
I think the Lebanese, there's often a sense, or at least a story they tell themselves, that these type of strikes are contained to, Shia neighborhoods, Hezbollah neighborhoods. But I think what we're seeing is an increasing sense that these attacks are happening in public areas where, bystanders can be indiscriminately hit. And I think it's a lot more uncomfortable today than it was yesterday. I think the people I spoke with, they were in general kind of outraged, even if they weren't Hezbollah supporters. But I think there was still a sense that, this is contained to, southern Beirut, and, I'm not a Hezbollah member. But I think a second day of these type of attacks definitely sows that kind of wider sense of terror of, what could happen when I pick up a device, what could happen in a busy street, what could happen in a supermarket.
And let's go through some of the details of what we know about how these explosives could have been planted in these devices. So the general assumption appears to be that Israel's spies somehow managed to infiltrate the supply chain leading from the pager manufacturers to the militia's fighters. So initial investigations into the pager's origins led to a Taiwanese firm, Gold Apollo, based in New Taipei. The company denied that it was involved in the design or manufacture of the AR-924 pagers involved in the attack, but it confirmed it had authorized the use of its brand, so subcontracted out its brand to a third company. That company is called Back Consulting and is registered to an address in Budapest, Hungary. Apollo's president, Su Qingqiang, also said that money transfers from them had been very strange, coming not from Hungary, but from the Middle East. This has all led journalists to this address in Budapest. It's a nondescript building with the company's name written on an A4 piece of paper stuck to a window. According to a source who didn't want to be named, the company is registered to the address, but has no physical presence there. Neighbours reported seeing no one entering or leaving the building for several weeks. All very odd so far, but speaking to NBC in a brief phone call, Back's chief executive said this: "I don't make the pages, I am just the intermediate. I think you got it wrong." While Apollo and Back are two known links in the supply chain, actual manufacturing of the components takes place at companies in China and Southeast Asia. There's also the question of transit from the ultimate supplier of the pages to Hezbollah, which is likely to occur through multiple intermediaries. Now, whatever the details, this was clearly a well-planned long-term operation by Israel, and massive injuries aside, the attack is likely to be deeply embarrassing for Hezbollah. They tend to be thought of as a very well-organized group. Hannah, that was sort of some background of what we might know in terms of where these things originated. This second strike, I mean, it was already presumably incredibly embarrassing that this happened in the first place. For there to have been a second day with a second set of equipment now sort of exploding and damaging Hezbollah, presumably. How embarrassing is this going to be?
Extremely embarrassing. And I think, again, it's going to create more chaos within Hezbollah. And I think it's going to be a real morale hit. Obviously, if fighters don't feel like they can trust the equipment that they're being given by the organization that they're working for, that's a problem for the organization working. And I mean, earlier in the year, fighters were being told if they had a mobile device on them in the battlefield, that they would be expelled from the group. So, there was a fairly hard line taken on that security approach and on giving people these pagers and these walkie-talkies, which have not been shown to be trustworthy. I mean, I think it's going to take a bit of time to get out the actual paper trail of how these pagers got into Lebanon. I mean, Hezbollah obviously does not directly contract with companies in Hungary. They use business fronts that usually enter into these deals on their behalf. So, I mean, I think that's going to be interesting to see, how that paper trail plays out over the next couple of weeks. I mean, I think it was interesting that there's now a spotlight on Hungary. As people may or may not know, Hungary is, Israel's strongest ally in the EU. It's one of the reasons that the EU wasn't able to release a statement condemning the US embassy moving to Jerusalem. It's kind of one of the reasons the EU hasn't been able to take such a strong stance on illegal settlements in the West Bank. So, I mean, I think that's an interesting dimension. More details have to come out of that before anyone can, point and say this person, was the person who colluded with Israel. But I mean, I think it's a very interesting strand of this.
In terms of Hezbollah as an organization, there's going to be, was this a cock-up? Was this a conspiracy? Was there, the person who was in charge of buying these, devices, were they colluding or collaborating with Israel? Was it just a mistake? Was it, someone a bit lower down the chain? Presumably that organization is now going to be having a quite panicked internal audit. I would imagine lots of people coming under suspicion, all while it seems many people are quite seriously injured. I mean, how damaging do you think this will be for Hezbollah to sort of act as a governing force, as a fighting force, as a force to be reckoned with?
I mean, I think in the short term, yes, it's definitely a blow. They're in a vulnerable position. There's going to be a lot of time spent reviewing equipment, reviewing who is relied on, who can they rely on for supplies again, who are the middlemen that can't be trusted, and all that makes organizations slower to act. I don't think in the long term Hezbollah is going to shift radically its approach to the war. I mean, I think a lot of the commentary about this attack is fairly accurate. It was tactically impressive, but the actual strategy behind it isn't clear. I mean, we're neither closer nor further away from a ceasefire deal. There is panic, but no one really senior in Hezbollah has been taken out. So, I mean, it's definitely a short-term punch, but I don't think it's enough to destabilize Hezbollah.
Let's talk about the international response. We got a clip from US Secretary of State Antony Blinken speaking at a press conference in Cairo this lunchtime.
The United States did not know about, nor was it involved in these incidents, and we're still gathering the information and gathering the facts. Broadly speaking, we've been very clear, and we remain very clear, about the importance of all parties avoiding any steps that could further escalate the conflict that we're trying to resolve in Gaza, to see it spread to other fronts. It's clearly not in the interest of anyone involved to see that happen. And that's why, again, it's imperative that all parties refrain from any actions that could escalate the conflict. We're focused on getting this ceasefire over the finish line. That would also, I think, materially improve the prospects of actually defusing the situation in northern Israel and southern Lebanon, particularly creating an environment in which people have the confidence to return to their homes, the tens of thousands of displaced people in Israel as well as in southern Lebanon. Getting the ceasefire would facilitate getting to that kind of agreement, and that's clearly the best path forward for everyone involved. So, again, it's imperative that everyone avoid taking steps that could further escalate or spread the conflict.
Not everyone in the West is taking such a mealy-mouthed approach to who is escalating this conflict. Belgium's Deputy Prime Minister said this: "I strongly condemn the massive terror attack in Lebanon and Syria, which injured thousands of people, a brutal escalation of violence. Silence is not an option. An international investigation is called for. The bloodshed must end." And even some UK politicians are taking a somewhat stronger line than what we're used to hearing. Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Emily Thornberry described the attacks as, quote, "another escalation that will affect us all." And she went on to tell Sky News this: "We are really concerned about what is happening now in Lebanon. I think the big question is why? Why is this happening now? And what will the result of that be? Is this the first step? And what will Israel do next? Is it part of a larger plan? It is very worrying, and I would certainly be expecting Israel's friends to be speaking very seriously to them and saying, what on earth are you doing?" Of course, these quotes were all in response to yesterday's attack. The diplomatic response to today's attacks are still filtering out. I know the UN will be, the UN Security Council, in fact, will be discussing this later today. Hannah, how do you sort of expect the international reaction to this to develop? I mean, I suppose all of our audience are going to be quite used to Israel being able to get away with anything. Do we assume that this will just be more of the same?
I think it's interesting that Germany has just announced that it's suspending weapons export permits to Israel. I'm not sure if this is in relation to the second attack or the first attack. It's just a kind of news bulletin come out. And I think it's certainly going to give added weight to any of those arguments around suspending arms licenses to Israel at the moment. Again, maybe questioning the strategy behind this attack and whether it was actually wise. I think it also underscores what a failure Americans' foreign policy has been in relation to Israel. I think the fact that the U.S. envoy Amos Hoxton, had an in-person meeting with Yoav Gallant, with Netanyahu on Monday, urging them to have a political deal. And at no point, apparently, according to at least to Blinken, was the U.S. informed that this attack was underway. And I think for them to engage in those meetings and for the U.S. to have spent billions on this relationship, just in the last year, to have invested all this time and for that to be the approach that Israel took, I think just shows you how little influence the Biden administration has in Israel and how much they have showed that there are no red lines. And I think this is exactly what happens if there are no red lines. Then we have this scenario, this unprecedented attack. And again, this is a year of unprecedented attacks, but this one is the one that kind of changes the calculus for future warfare. If this is the kind of attack that's fair game, that sets a very worrying precedent.
In terms of how this attack is being understood in the West, a lot of it comes down to how people understand Hezbollah, right? So I've seen sort of lots of commentary sort of defending, or, for people who usually defend Israel, sort of doing the same and saying this is actually a very, very targeted attack against a terrorist organization. Some people saying it's sort of the most targeted attack we've ever seen because they explicitly got the explosives in the hands of this terrorist organization. I suppose I'd like to hear how you think we should understand this. Was this a terrorist attack by Israel? How should people understand Hezbollah as an organization? How should people understand the people who are being targeted and the people who are collateral damage, I suppose, here?
So when Israel takes responsibility for attacks, for example, in the Gaza Strip, it often points to the fact that it has legal advisors attached to its military units, that there's a calculation undertaken for all of its attacks, that there is some sort of proportionality, and that while there is sometimes civilian casualties, there was a target. That kind of analysis, that is not possible to undertake that which is required under international humanitarian law. You cannot take that type of analysis in this type of attack where you have over 2,000 pagers that are going to explode in a number of unknown locations at an extremely busy hour. 3:30, that's an hour when children are coming home from school. It's an hour, particularly in Beirut, where roads are busy. And the fact that, the young girl who was killed, she was picking up her pager for her father, a completely foreseeable scenario. I think there has to be, Israel itself has, rejected the idea that, Israeli reservists, for example, were fair game on the 7th of October, that they were legitimate targets. And similarly, I think the fact that there's an approach that says every single person associated with Hezbollah, whether they were an active fighter or whether they were involved in the political wing, which is a member of the Lebanese parliament, whether people like it or not, and whether they were healthcare workers. Hezbollah runs hospitals. It has its own ambulance service. Whether all of these people were fair targets, and I think the Hezbollah fighters weren't just Hezbollah fighters. They were also Lebanese people, and they are part of Lebanese society. And I think, particularly in Lebanon, there was kind of a general sense of disgust whether they were Hezbollah supporters or not. I don't think those outside of Lebanon should see this as just a targeted attack on a terrorist organization.
Hannah McCarthy, thank you so much for joining us today. Incredible insight on a very fast developing story. We got some breaking news as well. In a non-binding vote, the UN General Assembly have passed a resolution demanding Israel end the occupation of West Bank and of the West Bank and Gaza. And this is the first resolution brought by the Palestinian ambassador, so since being recognized as a member state of the UN, and is the first General Assembly resolution since 1982 to advocate sanctions against Israel. The Home Office has announced that buffer zones will come into force around abortion clinics in England and Wales from the end of October. Parliament actually voted to introduce them back in May 2023, but the previous government said it would launch a consultation on guidance before allowing the buffer zones to be implemented. Campaigners at the time accused them of kicking the issue into the long grass. Following today's announcement, Safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips said this: "The right to access abortion services is a fundamental right for women in this country, and no one should feel unsafe when they seek to access this. We will not sit back and tolerate harassment, abuse, and intimidation as people exercise their legal right to healthcare." Protesters outside abortion clinics have long been an issue in the US, but they're a relatively new phenomenon in the UK and have become more common over the past decade. And women have spoken publicly about how protests outside abortion clinics have affected them.
It's hard enough, obviously, losing your baby and knowing as well that you've had to make the decision. But when you're driving past and you're seeing these people with signs saying things like abortion is murder, you feel so judged about the decision you've made.
4 years on, when she gave birth to her daughter Aria in the same building last summer, she had to see them again.
My mum would be driving and I'd have to basically sit with my phone to make sure I couldn't see them, and I would keep my eyes closed until we actually get into the hospital grounds.
Awful. We should ask, why have protests outside abortion clinics suddenly become a problem? As I said before, this is something I've always associated with the United States, not the UK. Well, it turns out the tactic crossing the Atlantic was no accident, according to the Good Law Project. The rise in protests coincided with a US right-wing anti-abortion group ramping up their funding for activities in the UK. They're called Alliance Defending Freedom. They helped overturn Roe v. Wade in the United States, which began the process of rolling back abortion rights in states over there. Between 2020 and 2022, they almost doubled their spending in the UK. Now, of course, the announcement of a date for the introduction of buffer zones is a step forward in the fight to protect abortion rights in this country, but right-wing groups have vowed to fight the move. Catholic Bishop John Sherrington gave an indication of the legal approach they're likely to take. Commenting on the Home Office announcement, he said, "The legislation constitutes discrimination and disproportionately affects people of faith." I mean, it only disproportionately affects people of faith if you want to go and protest people who are going to get an abortion. Helena, what do you make of this story? Another one of those, bits of relative good news from the Labour government, even if they're few and far between.
I mean, absolutely. I think one of the things that has been good about the the mood music that we're getting from this new Labour government, very specifically, is that they're taking misogyny seriously. They're taking the social stigma attached to things that women do very, very seriously, like making misogyny a hate crime. I support this. I absolutely support these buffer zones too, to try and protect vulnerable women who are having to go through a very difficult reproductive procedure and ensuring that they are not being harassed essentially by people. And comments like this, such as, "Oh, well, this is discrimination," and I'm like, well, you can still protest. You can still protest abortion, but just like any protest, you have to agree where you have that protest with the authorities first if you want to be able to have those demonstrations. And having them right outside abortion clinics, essentially doing this harassment of women, that's a really, really bad thing. And alongside Labour's broader plans to tackle things like violence against women and girls, I think that this is a really good step on the singular aspect of social policy, which I do think the Labour government is getting right, further to protect these kind of things moving forward, and actually really push back on what we're seeing as quite a kind of insidious, at least an insidious attempt by right-wing groups, especially American right-wing groups, to try and infiltrate UK politics.
It hasn't been the same with all these issues, but with this sort of far-right, religious right organisation, Defending Freedom, they funded travel for Tory MP or former Tory MP Fiona Bruce. She's now out of Parliament. They're also sort of very opposed to LGBTQ rights. Is this something that could be sort of a longer term thing we see with a Labour government, that there are sort of less religious right-wing kind of cranks in Parliament fighting these kind of causes? And I suppose, the analysis of why the Tory government passed this, but then it never really happened, is because you had all of these MPs in there sort of chipping away at the government. And I presume, if you're on the religious right, you're just going to have less influence over a Labour government in so many spheres. Although I know lots of people have been very critical of Wes Streeting over sort of his approach to trans rights. I don't know, where do you stand on this? Do you think the religious right are less of a threat with a Labour government?
Oh, 100%. But I don't think they were actually much of a threat during a Conservative government either, at least on this kind of Christian nationalist stuff that you get from places like the Alliance Defending Freedom, places like the Heritage Foundation. A lot of the things that they support are very specifically based in Christian nationalism, which is something they want to import from the US over to the UK. And not even amongst Conservative or even necessarily Reform UK voters does this really have any base at all in the UK. I think it's really important to create a delineation between this kind of Christian nationalism that's very anti-abortion and puts this very American issue at the forefront of their politics that has zero base in this country to be able to actually electorally or politically pander to over here than it does in the United States. But if we separate this from a broader let's say, anti-woke politics, now that does have a base, not a big one. It didn't see much pull during the election, but at least you can find people who want to have this kind of anti-woke politics be pandered to in this country, which is very different from what the Heritage Foundation and the ADF want to do. So if you look at, for example, the way in which the Conservative government, they collaborated with Policy Exchange to try and create, essentially Policy Exchange wrote their change in schools guidance for transgender and gender questioning children in school. That was essentially written by, I think it was a little bit of Lottie Moore over at Policy Exchange. So they had a very kind of intimate relationship in terms of how legislation was being set within that government. And of course, Policy Exchange, they're not connected with Christian nationalism or places like the Heritage Foundation at all, but they still want to be able to be there to have anti-woke policy talking about freedom of speech universities, for example, and that kind of right-wing anti-woke politics. There is a base for this. Miriam Cates, I think, was another MP who had a lot of connections to evangelical organizations. But even the UK ones kind of knew that you couldn't really get away in this country with trying to pander to the extremes of Christian nationalism like ADF do. But will we see less of this during a Labour government? Potentially. But they also have very strong links with places like Policy Exchange as well. Like having Nick Bowles, who set up Policy Exchange, was being considered for being their planning policy czar, for example, where Streeting's done speeches with them. So will we see less of it? Absolutely. But there'll still be influence there too.
It's only 2.5 months since Labour were elected with a whopping majority, and the new occupants of number 10 already absolutely hate each other. That's the only conclusion one can really draw from a story the BBC are running today. So the article is about Sue Gray. You'll have heard of her. She's Starmer's chief of staff, and the revelation that she's getting paid more than the Prime Minister. So according to the BBC, Sue Gray asked for and was given a salary of £170,000, which is £3,000 more than the PM and more than any cabinet minister. Of course, Starmer gets top-ups with free clothes and free cinema tickets and Coldplay tickets from very wealthy people, but we'll put that aside for one moment. Now, of course, this is potentially embarrassing, given Labour's endless talk about the dire state of the economy and the need for sacrifice. But it's the nature of the quotes given to the BBC from government insiders that are just as striking. So one told the BBC this: "It was suggested that she might want to go for a few £1,000s less than the Prime Minister to avoid this very story. She declined." Another said this: "It speaks to the dysfunctional way Number 10 is being run. No political judgment, an increasingly grand Sue who considers herself to be the Deputy Prime Minister, hence the salary, and no other voice for the Prime Minister to hear, as though everything gets run through Sue." Now, one reason there are so many insiders willing to give angry briefings is apparently because many lower-level special advisors have been disappointed to find out they're getting paid less than they expected. That's because they're getting paid less as government employees than they were when they were working directly for the Labour Party. Someone described by the BBC as a furious advisor told them this: "It's bizarre. I'm working harder than ever in a more important job, and they want to pay me less than the Labour Party was paying me when it was broke." So this is why these people are speaking to the BBC, presumably because they've got a bit of a chip on their shoulder. One criticism being levelled at the highly paid Sue Gray is that she supposedly didn't fulfil her main job working for the opposition, which was to prepare Labour for government. So a special advisor, they didn't say if this one was furious or not, quipped to the BBC: "If you ever see any evidence of our preparations for government, please let me know." The most cutting attack on Gray, though, came not via the BBC, but via the Times journalist Gabriel Pogrund. He tweeted this today: Senior Labour source, quote, Sue Gray is the only pensioner better off under Labour. Helena, they haven't been in Downing Street for long. You often see this when everything starts to go wrong, maybe towards the end of a parliament. It's only been 2.5 months. They are fighting like rats in a sack already.
Absolutely. What, can you hear what that is? Do you hear what I hear? Oh, that's the sound of the adults being back in the room, isn't it? It really is being very dysfunctional very, very quickly. Turns out, once they were busy fighting the left internally within the Labour Party for a very, very long time. Now the left have gone. They've got no one left to fight with other than each other. And isn't it wonderful to see? Now, actually, I think that the basis of this, I actually don't care about whether or not Sue Gray is getting paid more than the Prime Minister. Maybe the Prime Minister should get paid more. £160,000 is a lot, but that's still less than comparable countries. But as you say, what this does show is the level to which these people just don't seem to kind of catch what's really important here, which is you're engaging in public service now. Maybe you're getting paid less than you were as a Labour Party employee than a government employee, because previously you were getting paid by mostly kind of private individuals in a kind of post-Starmer world, I guess, rather than trade union funding. Now you're working on public money. Maybe think more about what your role is, rather than having this kind of careerist thinking of, well, actually, I should be I'm in this really important position. I should be getting paid loads of money. Maybe just have a little bit of humility for 1 second with regards to this. Also, second of all, is that people like Morgan McSweeney, people like Pat McFadden, they thought their whole plan were going to purge the left, we're going to make Labour the natural party of government. Does this look like the natural party of government to you, or does it look like a total mess? They had a Middle East appointee, like for the Middle East position. They didn't appoint for 2 weeks until after the election. Luckily, of course, nothing of any relevance was going on in the Middle East at the time. The biggest quote out of all of this that I find very, very funny is that Sue Gray is being treated like a proxy deputy prime minister at this point. That's how people view her. How humiliating must it be to be Angela Rayner, that when you were in opposition, people were treating Rachel Reeves as if she was the de facto deputy leader of the opposition. And now they're in government. Sue Gray is being treated like the de facto deputy prime minister. All of that in the background, trying to suck up to the leadership and getting into this high-level position, and suddenly you're getting usurped by people who haven't been into elected that position at all. Must be nice.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I don't really care if she's getting paid 170 grand or not. But I do think there's a competency issue here, right? Because Keir Starmer for ages said, I really want to make my mission to reestablish people's faith in politics. They've lost so much faith in politics under the Conservatives. I'm going to make sure they realise that we are working for their benefit. And it's been less than 3 months, and we're seeing so many headlines about him receiving 100 grand worth of tickets to Coldplay, to Adele, having like a really special corporate box at Arsenal. And this is not going to restore anyone's faith in politics. And then you've got all of these Labour insiders who've just this should be the biggest privilege of their life. Finally, they're working in Whitehall. Presumably, they tell you that they've done everything they've done because they're desperate to get the opportunity to change Britain. And all they can do is fight over who's getting paid more. This is not the headlines you want when you've just got into power to try and restore trust in politics. It's ridiculous. Like the thing that I find more shocking with the Keir Starmer sort of accepting all these tickets and stuff is not, are they corrupting him? Maybe they. That's a worry. But the thing I find surprising is that he was stupid enough to sort of say, oh yeah, why would there be any inconsistency with me attacking Boris Johnson every day for what wallpaper he uses, and me taking all of these freebies to go to Adele concerts and get my wife nice dresses? Like, it just doesn't sort of. With Starmer, we've spoken about this so much on this show. Sort of, is there some sort of 4D chess going on? Does he have this project? And sort of, he went into this election sort of obviously boxing himself in, but maybe this is all part of the plan, and he's going to come out and actually he is going to have this plan for growth in Britain. He kind of seems like someone who doesn't have a clue what he's doing, which is a little bit worrying. I want the guy to manage to get Britain to grow, right? To raise people's living standards. And it seems like he's a bit of an amateur. Presumably he was a good lawyer, but is he a good politician? We're very much yet to see. Tory leadership frontrunner Kemi Badenoch has appeared on Christopher Hope's GB News podcast and laid out her worldview. She described herself as very right-wing and was asked if her kids shared her views.
I think my kids are pretty right wing. I have a 4-year-old who thinks being vegetarian is a very bad thing.
What do you feed it red? What do you feed him? Is it him or her? Red
ribs,
meat.
She loves bacon, sausages. So I asked her once. I said, I had another friend over. Tell them what your favorite food is, and she said ribs, bacon, sausages, black pudding, lamb chops, and it was actually hysterical listening to her.
So there's a difference between her really liking meat and thinking vegetarianism is a very bad thing. As a 4-year-old, if you're aged 4 and you're already saying like stupid vegetarians, why are they so moral? I don't want to disparage Kemi Badenoch's 4-year-old. I'm sure they're lovely. I'm not in the business of criticizing the political views of 4-year-olds, but. Should 4-year-olds have political views? If she just likes ribs, fine, whatever. If she's already got bugbear against all vegetarians, I have some questions about the parenting there, I think. Also, at that age, she's supposed to really like animals, right? It's like, you idiots, why won't you eat all the pigs like me? Seems a little bit strange. Again, not to disparage the child, but I'm not sure that story from Kemi Badenoch sort of paints her sort of familial environment in a fantastic light. Of course, that explanation raised more questions than it answered. Most of the rest of the interview was as you'd expect. She railed against wokeness, vowed to crack down on immigration, criticized environmentalism, like mother, like daughter, and denied that Michael Gove was pulling the strings behind the scenes of her campaign. There was one more interesting moment, though, when she discussed her teenage job at McDonald's.
You worked in McDonald's. I mean,
Yes,
that'd be
did.
the first PM to ever worked in McDonald's, I think. I can't believe Rishi Sunak worked in McDonald's. What was that taught you about?
It was the first time that I interacted properly with people who didn't come from the sort of background that I came from. I grew up in a middle-class family, but I became working class when I was 16 working in McDonald's.
It's a funny idea. You're middle class, you go work at McDonald's for a little bit when you're 16, and then suddenly you're working class. I suppose she's saying, she can relate to the working class because she worked in McDonald's. Fair enough. I'm not really sure that sort of played out in her politics. You could also argue that any idea of class as related to work and income is still better than Starmer, who sees it as a lifelong status based on how much money your parents had in 1973. Helena, Kemi Badenoch is still the favourite to be Tory leader. Obviously, she's trying to get herself out there. I suppose at the moment, she's trying to sort of appeal to Tory party voters who are probably impressed, if you've raised a 4-year-old that already hates vegetarians. But what do you make of her campaign so far?
Oh my God. I mean, if you're a Labour Party bigwig looking at the Conservative leadership contest and Kemi coming out as the front runner, you must be laughing your way down to the bank, even whilst they're capitulating. Suddenly the Conservative Party looking even more unserious by comparison. Now, talk about those kind of working class conversation, the statement that she made there. As you say, it's definitely far closer to an actual discussion of class than Keir Starmer ever gets, where his definition was just people who want to get by. And I'm just like, okay, that's meaningless. At least she understands that it's about your relationship to production. But unfortunately, it's actually about how you are forced to engage in your relationship to production. There's a difference between somebody who has to survive by working at McDonald's and has to sell their labour power for a wage every day, and somebody who's getting it as a Saturday job in between their time being paid to go to private school by your rich parents, right? Like, there's a big difference between that. And if you want to try and say that changed you to be working class because you spent 5 minutes around people who actually came from poor backgrounds, like, put the fries in the bag, little sis, at the end of the day. But with regard to the other statements that she's made, it's very clear to me that she's just another kind of brain-rotted, like, culture warrior who doesn't have a serious campaign to actually talk about the real issues that cost the Conservative Party the election. At the point at which her definition of, really my daughter must be right-wing because she eats meat. I'm sorry, like, the differentiation between different sides of the political spectrum is not based around your consumption of different food products at the end of the day. And banging on, maybe immigration is going to be a big issue, but banging on about kind of climate policy and environmentalism when our country is incredibly pro pro-climate policy. John Bunn Murdoch from the Financial Times got some really good data on this, showing that even our Conservatives are far more green in terms of their policy preferences than most Democrats in America, basically every party in France and every party other than the Greens in Germany. And they're our right-wing party. This isn't an electorally successful idea. And the big reason that the Tories lost the election was because of the cost of living. It was the state of the NHS. It was their failure at managing the economy. And when I watched her interview with The Telegraph on the Daily Tea, she was saying things like, oh, it's all about our frustrations with the civil service and trying to deal with critical race theory and being talked about these different cultural issues. And then she touched on, well, her favourite politician being Thatcher. Well, it was Thatcherism. It was adherence to neoliberal doctrine that screwed you over at the last election because the NHS collapsed and wages didn't rise when inflation was very, very high. So if you think you have your finger on the pulse to turn the fortunes of the Conservative Party around, Kemi, you're going to be sorely mistaken in 5 years' time when either the Labour Party get their act together and either grow the economy, or Nigel Farage talks in real terms about the public's actual concerns, not in a way that will actually solve them, but at least looking sincere and like he cares, rather than being somebody who's busy talking about who she's beefing with on Twitter.
In a BBC Newsnight interview, Diane Abbott has spoken out on her relationship with Keir Starmer.
I think initially I was treated as a non-person, which felt very strange because, well, at the same time, they were writing to party members trying to raise money on the back of how Hester had treated me without mentioning me, which was a bit odd.
And when you say non-person, I mean, what do you mean by that?
Well, you'd feel that if somebody was threatening to have you shot, you would have felt that your party would have offered you more support, given you advice on safety and security, even kind of commiserated with you, and none of that happened.
And are you saying that the leader, Keir Starmer, treated you as a non-person?
As I recall, Keir Starmer treated me as a non-person, and I got more support from the leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn, than I got from the leader of my own party.
She's kind of the queen of understatement, isn't she? So you've described him as a non-person. Well, I mean, if it were the case that someone had said how they wanted you shot, you might expect them to show you some recognition, some commiseration. But no, as she said, they sent out fundraising emails based on those comments about her without mentioning her name. Diane Abbott also discussed her suspension from the Labour Party last year and condemned certain policy choices.
For the investigation to drag on for 8 months, when other people who've committed similar offences had their cases wound up in a couple of months, I thought that was quite strange.
So what do you think was going on?
I think that Keir Starmer wanted to finish his clear-out of the left in the Parliamentary Labour Party. And by writing a very ill-advised letter, I gave them the opportunity to move against me. And I think what they were trying to do was to string out the investigation. So when a general election was around the corner, they could just move me out of the way as a Labour candidate because I wouldn't be in the Parliamentary Labour Party and parachute in someone else.
Well, I don't think there's anyone in the country listening to that who would disagree with that. Very clearly, that was their plan, to kick out everyone on the left, and they didn't expect the backlash that came, in particular because of the suspension of Diane Abbott, because I think no one close to Keir Starmer had any idea whatsoever as to what she meant, not just to the Labour left, but also to black people and especially black women in this country. And then the way they treated her, they had no idea that backlash was coming, right? No idea. We talk about the people around Keir Starmer being a bit out of touch. I think that was as good an example as any. Let's hear what Diana Abbott had to say about Starmer's government so far.
I'm a bit worried about the cutting of the winter fuel allowance. And one of the things that's difficult about it, I think particularly for newer colleagues, people don't vote Labour only for a few weeks later. People, the Labour Party take money off pensioners.
Do you fear being suspended again? Or
No. I mean, they took it away from me once. It's up to them if they want to do it again. No, I'm not fussed about that.
So it's really interesting sort of seeing Diane Abbott there. I suppose because she's already survived that attempt to get rid of her, she seems to be a bit more confident than other Labour left MPs when it comes to criticising Keir Starmer, both in interviews there. I mean, also sort of earlier this week, she sort of tweeted Keir Starmer with Georgia Maloney, sort of saying, what's he doing, talking to a fascist? She seems like she is not so terrified as losing the whip as many other Labour MPs. I suppose, because what does she have to lose? I imagine she probably won't be standing in an election in 4 years' time. I think in essence, probably on some level, she might have wanted to stand out at the last one, but she didn't want to do so in a manner where she was being humiliated by the horrible right-wing thugs around Keir Starmer. But it is interesting. Helena, do you think Diane Abbott, is potentially going to be one of the more empowered Labour MPs when it comes to being critical of Keir Starmer, precisely because he tried and failed to get rid of her?
Oh yeah, for sure. I remember at the time, I think there was reported that Keir Starmer had asked her, "Is there anything I can do to help you?" after the Frank Hester's comments, and she said, "You should give me back the whip," and then got completely blanked after that, or had that request ignored, of course, because they were at the time deliberately misleading the press and the public by saying, "Oh well, this is all out of our hands. We need to wait for the investigation to get cleared," when it had already been cleared, and the whips were just trying to wait out the clock until parliamentary elections were going on for the future general election. One of the biggest criticisms that Diane Abbott gets, because of like one moment a few years ago, they say, "Oh well, no, she's not politically savvy," or they will mock her for that, mess up on a couple of numbers. This just shows just how politically savvy that she really is. That she's masterfully on her own, essentially, been able to kind of run rings around what I'm assuming the people within the Labour Party, within the Starmer Politburo, believe to be an incredibly well-executed campaign trying to remove the left from the party. And on her own, she's managed to completely circumvent that by playing to the media in the best way possible, especially in the wake of those Frank Hester comments. It was clear for a long time the press were never going to hold any of the Labour right accountable over what had happened. They, stuff like with Lloyd Russell Moyle and with especially Faiza Shaheen, where she was getting removed from her position just because one of the reasons they gave us she was making the party look bad by saying that by raising concerns over Islamophobia. But the real kind of tipping point was them still being nasty to Diane Abbott over the whip in the wake of the Frank Hester comments. And she took that and she used that to put a stop. The purge immediately stopped as soon as this came out. And the public, when polled, showed actually they thought the Labour right were massively in the wrong. And they thought not just Diane Abbott, but Jeremy Corbyn should be allowed back into the party. The public opinion turned because Diane Abbott was clearly trying to be able to make the crowd turn against the Labour right. And she did it incredibly well. And what this shows, there was a really great article on Novara's website by an ex-Momentum organiser talking about how to be able to defeat the Labour right from the left, it's about hard power as well as soft power. And that hard power has to come from within the Labour Party as well as outside the Labour Party. Now, I, of course, am a Green Party member and a Green Party supporter, but it actually is super important that we do have people who, now they know they have the power to challenge the leadership from the inside. In the same way that Nigel Farage has his own friends within the Conservative Party as well, we need to have people broadly as a left-wing ideological movement, and need to have people within the Labour Party who are fighting for our interests as well. It's no good just to say, "Oh, it's all over, everybody has to leave," because it clearly shows that even rhetorically, with regards to how she can use the media to her advantage, people like Diane Abbott, people like Zara Sultana have made it very clear that they can now be openly critical in the wake of what has seemed to be very draconian measures by the Labour right to try and get rid of these people, which hasn't been received well, not before the election with people like Dan, and not after the election, given the 7 who were suspended over the 2-child benefit cap vote as well. So a really, really excellently worked political strategy from Diane Abbott there.
Yeah, she said. I think they wanted her to sort of end her parliamentary career in sort of embarrassment, and I think she has really come out sort of with a great deal of pride, and it's actually really wonderful to see. Thanks, Helena, for joining me tonight.
Always a pleasure, Michael. Thank you for having me.
And thank you, everyone, for watching. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.